trying to think of how to start this. And I think I'll start it with this. When looking at the interpretations of the Bible and of the U.S. Constitution, in both of these things you have the liberals and the conservatives, right? You have the liberal interpretation of the Bible and a literal interpretation of the Bible. Liberal interpretation of the U.S. Constitution and a strict, literal, conservative interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. So, and what I've finally come to the conclusion is that the distinction between what is called left and what is called right is not so much ado about economic ideology, which makes sense, because in an evolutionary context, economic ideology is non-existent, right? There's no reason for such an abstract way of thinking to evolve. So there's that. And also, if we observed, primitive tribes, we see, it's national socialism or tribal collectivism. Primary unit communism, essentially working at that level. So I mean that's and of course they'll cooperate to a degree with other tribes, or sometimes they'll war with other tribes, and so there's degrees and nuances and complexity as to what is the nationality or the tribality. But that's fundamentally what it is. It's NS, right? NS is nature. So, and based on that, what we would presume would be that this kind of economic ideology has to do with not with the economic ideology itself, but adherence to Scripture, or at least a perception of Scripture, or the old beliefs. Okay, because every tribe has their beliefs. Okay, and if you upset these beliefs, they'll get very upset with you. And so we can look at people in a tribal setting as kind of existing on a continuum. To what degree do they conform or uphold or treat as exceptional the beliefs of their specific tribe? Okay. And the people who are going to treat those beliefs more exceptionally likely be what we call political conservatives. Okay, people who treat their beliefs less exceptionally are going to be political liberals, and this, of course, explains why you see among whites political liberals, or what are called liberals, being less religious. Now, when you deal with blacks, the situation is somewhat inverted, right? Because what is conservatism to blacks? Conservatism to blacks is support for the U.S. Democrat Party, because it's anti-white and perceived to be pro-black. That's perception. So a black with a right-wing conservative mentality votes Democrat. Okay. So, and blacks are very religious, very conservative, right? They're the most religious group in the United States, and of course they're the most set voting Democrat. They're much more set voting Democrat than whites are Republicans. Whites are, I believe, in the last election was 59% Republican, whereas blacks were 93% Democrat. So blacks are very hardcore conservative, right? It's just that they're on the other side. And economic ideology, I think something that confuses a lot of people, this is kind of a wrench in what is actually a rather simple dynamic. A wrench in there is economic freedom. And that is something that is kind of unique to the United States, and to a lesser extent Canada and Britain and Australia. This is the idea of free speech and economic freedom. Historically radical levels of economic freedom That's part of U.S. scripture, going back to, you know, 19, Jesus Christ, going back to the Revolution, right? Going back to 1776 and ways before that as well. Of course, not at the very beginning, because at the very beginning, European powers colonizing were trying to basically extend feudalism to the New World, but then that didn't really work. And that's kind of why the New World became the land of the free, because they weren't able to, because these European powers, for various reasons, it's a long, complicated subject, weren't able to impose feudalism. And so you got people going into this area a belief, a sense of entitlement, and a sense of radical freedom, economic freedom, which included the freedom to starve and die, right? And that was kind of accepted, you know. Back then, they had a more realistic conception of freedom, right? Whereas people today, they think of freedom, and that's a very good word, and they only really take the positive aspects of that. They don't also recognize that it's also freedom to die, right? Freedom to die a very horrible death in the winter. Okay, but that was just kind of implicitly understood back then. At least that's what I think. So, and there was this ideology of freedom, and it wasn't. And at the time, it wasn't a really, how do I say this? It wasn't like freedom versus no freedom. No, freedom versus security. Okay, and people who emigrated to the United States chose freedom over security, freedom and opportunity, greater upside, with the cost of a greater downside. Right, we were more likely to die. There's no real dole in the Americas because there's not a whole lot of effective governance, especially on the frontiers. And this created a people who had a different ideology, and originally that was kind of a new radical liberal thing. But eventually, what becomes established, and this goes back to public opinion, what hangs around for a long enough time goes from being the liberal new thing to the old encrusted, right, established. Right? It becomes the establishment. Right? Same thing kind of what you saw with the Soviet Union. Right? You saw, early on you had the radicals doing the Soviet Union thing. And then by the 1990s you had these old fogey, they were called the conservatives. They were called the conservatives, and some were called the reactionaries. They were the reactionaries trying to maintain the Soviet Union amidst the democratic revolutions, right? Or the more kind of social, we'll call them the social democratic revolutions. And that's kind of what you had in the United States early on. You had it was a liberal new thing, right? And it came from an abandonment of prior views on a prior conception of political economy, and it was part of this lack of effective governance that I believe ultimately led to the revolution against Britain. A revolution which was chosen at a time when Britain was at war with Spain, France, Holland, which was a more substantial power then than it is now, and a kingdom in yes, I think I said Spain, and a little kingdom in India called Mysore. And there's a lot of people in India. I don't know how many people were specifically in that province of Mysore, but probably about as many people as there were in Britain. And while obviously they had zilch in terms of technological, just having that many people causes, being at war with a little Indian principality, with whatever it is. I think I did something in the past. I estimated it had about 15 million people in this little principality of Mysore that was at war with Britain. Having to send troops over there, I mean, that's more people than were in the colonies. Okay, there's about 2.4 million in the colonies, about 8 million in Britain itself. So, I mean, you can kind of overlook, well, it was an issue, right? Because first off, Mysore had home field advantage, and they had a big population advantage. Okay, plus Britain was busy fighting wars, as I said, with Spain, France, and Holland. So Britain was really overstretched when the United States, or not the United States, the Continental Congress and the 13 colonies declared independence. And so now Britain was at war with them as well. So what's amazing is how effective the British were in the 13 colonies, right? That's what's really impressive. Okay. Not the fact that the United States stood against the most powerful. Well, okay, most powerful. What does that mean? I mean, they had a very powerful navy, but how many? But okay, so Britain controls the seas, but then they have to land in the colonies and try to take over that area. Okay, that's a massive. I mean, even if the colonies had no troops, that's still a massive logistical expense. Okay, so it was not an impressive victory. I'll just leave it at that. Not and and the United States needed French help to win as it was. So even with all the advantages that they had, they still needed direct French intervention to succeed. So, but that's going a bit far afield here. What separates these kinds of outlooks? What separates it? Well, in all places and all times, you seem to have people who are more traditional in their views, and you have to be a little bit not retarded in understanding what the traditions really are. Okay. What are the traditions in the United States? Because something like you could say, historically, the civil rights thing happened. Okay, that happened, and there was a time when that wasn't the tradition, but it's probably the tradition now. And I say that because of its overwhelming support in both Republican and Democrat Party. Okay, everyone supports the Civil Rights Act. That's tradition. Okay, and that's what traditionalists in the United States support. That's what, old-timey conservatives support. Benito Mussolini said he didn't believe in race, but he did believe in nationality. Well, okay. His comments on race were more of a descriptive, biological thing. He didn't believe in any kind of biological race. What Mussolini meant by that, A, I don't know, and B, I don't care. Because, one, I mean, he's dead and he's not influential, so there's that. And what he means by race not existing biologically is kind of like, I mean, that's such a vapid discussion. Like, when people say race doesn't exist, like, you have to ask them, what do you mean doesn't exist? I mean, they'll try to ask you, what do you mean by race? Well, you could do the same sort of thing regarding breed, but say, for example, you think black people don't biologically exist. What do you mean? You mean black skin doesn't exist? No. Okay. Well then what do you mean? Well then they'll say something like, well, the distances are very small, which and I've been through this rigmarole a million times. But what separates what is called the right wing from the left wing? And it's not economics. It's really not. You look at the National Socialists in Germany. You look at all the far right movements in Europe. They're not libertarian. They don't. I mean, the BNP does not hold to libertarian economic ideals. Okay. I think what's called Le Pen, they're national. They don't hold to economic ideals. They hold to, the Golden Dawn doesn't. Golden Dawn wants an expansion of the welfare state. Okay, the BNP wants to kind of basically maintain the welfare state. So this kind of conflation between economic liberty, economic freedom, and the right wing. I mean, this seems to be a really American and possibly Canadian tradition, right? That comes from the unique histories of the United States and Canada and possibly Australia. But if we can tease that out. We can say that that's not that support for radical levels of economic freedom. If we can say that that's not an inherently quote unquote right wing, I will say biologically right wing bias. If we can say that that's not the case, then what are we dealing with? Then what is right wing? And I think I finally settled to it. Going back to primitive tribes and their sort of national socialism. Nobody in the tribe would not do his fair share or give his fair cut. Okay, just, in all the little tribal documentaries I've seen, and I've seen 8, there was never a reported instance of somebody being selfish and withholding from others like that. It simply didn't happen, and the concept of it never even came up. Okay, that stuff doesn't happen. Okay, so this idea that economic free marketers in the United States are just selfish on a personal, individual, kind of interpersonal level as a person is just bullshit, because that probably doesn't exist. Like it probably just simply does not exist. Okay. What does exist is, fuck you, you're not in my tribe. Right? Happy to share with my tribe, but you're not my tribe. I am my brother's keeper, but you're not my brother. Right? And that's where you get the libertarian. Okay, and the libertarian might, if you ask him this, he might say, well, I'm opposed to the phrase my brother's keeper, because and when I hear someone say that, I also get nervous, because I know there's going to be a bunch of bullshit dropped on me about how I need to help people in Africa. Okay. So kind of practically, there's probably a kind of Pavlovian opposition to these exhortation of collective of sharing, basically, because what it means in practice is sharing with foreigners. Okay, it means sharing with blacks and mestizos and Asians and Europeans who I hate, So it means stuff coming from us and being given over to foreigners. Okay. Foreigners who happen to be labeled United States citizens. Oh, they're U.S. citizens. That doesn't mean anything. They're still foreigners. Okay. And that's I think the reality of the libertarian movement. Okay. Now you could say, well, no, the reality of the libertarian movement is a rational, pure. It's a movement of pure reason, or some other such bullshit. Well, there's that possibility, and I think maybe in the future I'll get into a more thorough deconstruction of several, what are broadly considered libertarian positions, and how it's not a rational thing that you came to. It's a bunch of. I don't want to go down that road anymore. And also, when looking at libertarianism, there's a sense of personal property. Okay, like individual private property does exist, even in these hunter-gatherer societies. Right, people would have their spear, their hammock, their whatever. Now, what? Okay, and so personal private property their pet. Okay, personal private property did exist. Okay, but it wasn't such that it would be, no, this is my rope, and I'm not going to help you make a hammock for yourself. And I'm going to keep it all to my, like that. That's not what they would do. That's not the kind of private property that they engaged in, which was, excluding others from resources. Right? That's not how the private property works. The private property was a matter of personal possessions. Okay, when other people started getting into your personal possessions, that's when, the fangs came out. All right, and that's the individual private property. The fangs will come out in two instances. One is when someone's trying to, homestead your toothbrush. right? Or homestead your toilet, okay, trying to take your personal possessions. Or when somebody who's not a member of your tribe is taking your resources, taking your food, or taking your females, okay, your resources. So when, so that's and when you look at libertarians, well, what you see is that people who are not, I mean, obviously they're not autistic, okay, but there's kind of an autism spectrum, right? To what degree do you are you more kind of social, or are you more individualistic? Well, on the autism spectrum, like people who are more individualistic in their personal behaviors, right, at an interpersonal level, they are going to be more kind of like mine, one. And two, they're probably also going to be a bit more skeptical of outsiders, right? I mean, there are those kinds of people, and we all know who these kinds of people are. These kinds of people, very hard to make friends, but once you do make friends with them, they're very good friends, right? And they have a very kind of a narrow, redundant circle of friends, right? And I think that that's kind of what libertarians are in their personal life. And so when you get into these higher level political dealings, you're dealing with abstract issues that human minds are not able to deal with. Okay, so human rationality, human judgment is kind of in terms of assessing why people believe what they do. So when you're dealing with these higher level political movements, what you have is sort of a projection of what's going on at a lower level to a higher level. Individual private property is projected into support for libertarianism if you're kind of, more towards the autism side of the autism spectrum, right? You're going to be more pro private property, right? Women are a little bit less that way. And so that's one thing that will cause people to support libertarianism. Another thing is a sense of outsiderness, that other Americans are outsiders, right? And so they're not willing to share. In times of war, right, a certain necessity, the tribes need to come together to defeat a common opponent, right? Then, a greater level of sort of communitarianism, a higher order communitarianism is then enacted in order to deal with the greater threat, right? So that can occur in times of war. But if there's no menacing foreign threat, well then, these people who call themselves other Americans, at a conscious level, at a cognitive level, you may be able to recognize them as fellow Americans and say that and murmur those words. But the implicit association tests and there have been studies in terms of how much sympathy is evoked when someone's in pain. Like when a white person sees a black person in pain, they register in like this in the brain helmet, the MRIs. They register less empathy than if a white person is experiencing pain, right? So I don't know about studies regarding other tribes of the same race, who you say is like a political liberal. I know that that has happened with political views. That if you tell someone who's a liberal beforehand that the person that they're looking at is liberal like them, then they will rate them as more physically attractive. See? So it's like layers upon layers here. Whereas you see, like in the past, it was much simpler because you had these tribes, and in these tribes you had behavior on kind of a one-dimensional continuum. The right wing and the left wing. The right wing was more traditional, was more upholding of the tribe's beliefs, okay, upholding of the tribe's beliefs, and wary of outsiders, right? So those two things go hand in hand, upholding traditional beliefs and wariness of outsiders. And you see this. You see this in terms of liberal and conservative interpretation of the Bible and the Constitution. But then, at a higher level, you get people. I mean, these two continuums then form political factions. But then these political factions themselves become tribes in and of themselves. And you get an odd situation where you get people in Minnesota who vote Democrat because they voted Democrat for as long as they have, and voting Democrat is itself a tribal identity, right? The original split came from a kind of continuum within tribes of people, right? The right wing and the left wing, right? A one-dimensional spectrum. But following the formation of political parties has then become itself a tribal thing. Okay? And so you have a situation now where the Democrat Party platform is itself a form of conservative belief. Right? So both Republican and Democrat Party platforms, to the extent they're any different at all, it's perceptions really what we're talking about. I mean, I go on later about how actual policy are virtually identical under Republicans and Democrats. And it's impossible to distinguish whether or not whatever differences you think there are a result of differences in opportunity. But that aside, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing that these political parties have themselves formed into their own tribes, their own traditions, right? There is in fact a progressive tradition, right, and a conservative tradition. These are two different traditions that have formed, right? And so that has itself had an effect, but there's also, both things are happening at the same time, right? There's one thing which is the Democrat and Republican traditionalism, right? That's happening on both sides. But then there's also people who are more innately, conservative, okay? And if they're more conservative and they're white, they're going to go towards the Republican Party. I'm talking about the biological temperament. If by their biological temperament they're more conservative and they're white, they're going to go towards the Republican Party. If they're biologically more conservative and they're black, they're going to go more towards the Democrat Party. Right? If they're liberal and they're white, they're going to go for the Democrat Party. If they're liberal and they're black, they're going to go for the Republican Party. Okay. And if they're liberal and they're black, I'm not talking about like what you think liberal and conservative mean in terms of actual political positions. I'm talking about these polar biological spectrums. I'm talking about their biological temperament. Okay. By the biological temperament, a left-wing black is going to be, more of a supporter of a biologically left-wing black. Biologically left-wing black is going to be more supportive of the Republican Party than of the Democrat Party, but there's also the possibility that he's going to be a full-blown socialist, right? Identify with the U.S. Communist or Socialist Party or the Green Party, okay, and not identify with his race, and that's where we finally getting to the point that all this is leading up to, is that, in my view, the functional distinction, and so much of this complexity just melts away when you look at it from the point of view of group identity. What is a right-wing black? Well, there's group identity there. Okay? And that's fundamentally why the Democrats are in such a fundamentally stronger position than the Republicans, because all the Republicans have is the white right. The Democrats have the white left, the black right, the mestizo right, a big chunk of the mestizo left, a big chunk of most of the black left, if such a thing even exists. The Asian right and the Asian left. So basically, the Democrat Party has managed to make itself the party of racial identity for all these racial groups and the party of multiculturalism. Okay? Whereas the Republican Party has only been able to make itself the party of racial identity for whites. Okay? And that's really what the Republican Party is, under the hood. It's the white party. It's the white nationalist party. Okay. Now, the Democrat Party is both, it's the black nationalist, Aztlan nationalist, various Asian, pan-brown nationalist, you can say, that kind of identity, to the degree that that exists, plus, the left. And and if we go back to a much more simpler understanding, go back to a lower level, a simpler tribal level, that's what left and right fundamentally are. It's group identity, and part of group identity is the traditions of the group. It's the beliefs of the group. Okay? And those things go hand in hand. If you are a firm believer in group identity, you're also going to be a firm believer in traditions. Okay? And so all this kind of, there seems to be a degree of confusion in labels where you have people who are libertarians, some people calling themselves libertarians, some people calling themselves white nationalists, and some people calling themselves traditionalists. And there's these circular doors where people are going in and out of all of these things, being these three things at the same time. And it makes sense in the context of a biological group identity thing. All these are just manifestations of group identity at a higher level. And it also explains why blacks are very, very unlikely to vote Republican. Because if the blacks are by their biology liberal, then they're not very prone to their group beliefs, and they're not very prone to group identity, right? They're wanting to mix it up, right? And both are strategies that are useful for tribes at different places and times, right? To fight on, to fight to the end, or to buckle under and be subservient, right? And if you think that a biological group submission is an impossible thing, well, I mean, we know that such a behavior is hardwired and will manifest in individuals. Individuals will submit in defeat, right? And even in something as innocuous as a chess match, if you lose a chess match, your testosterone levels will go down a little bit. Okay, I mean, it's not like getting the shit beat out of you where your testosterone levels will collapse, but the effect is there, right? And so there's a biological mechanism for individual submission. But what about group submission? Well, it is I've read an article about a study claiming that quote-unquote conservatives are stronger than liberals. Now, they did not control for race. I believe if they controlled for race, this would be even stronger. There's also been another article which shows that people with larger biceps, they measure their biceps and their political views and their socioeconomic status. People with the bigger biceps tended to be more firm advocates of their socioeconomic status. So if they had big biceps and were wealthy, or perceive themselves to be wealthy, that's what really matters, not whether or not they actually are, but if they perceive themselves to be wealthy, they tended to be more in favor of economic policies that are perceived to benefit the wealthy. Right now, some libertarians say, no, free markets benefit all. Okay, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about perceptions here. If they have big biceps and they're of lower socioeconomic status, they tend to be much more heavily in favor of policies that benefit lower socioeconomic status, or perceived to. But what's the inverse of that? Well, if you have smaller biceps, presumably you have lower testosterone. You're a little bit less masculine, you're going to be more in favor of policies that benefit a perceived out-group at the expense of the perceived in-group, right? And unfortunately, all of this is abstracted in modern U.S. politics, and that individuals have multiple in-groups and multiple out-groups, right? They have their racial in-group and out-group. They have their political in-group and out-group, and they have their socioeconomic status in-group and out-group. And you could also add to this the religious in-groups and out-groups. And there's degrees of out-groups and degrees of in-groups in all of these things. Okay? And all these things are abstracted at a higher level than humans were evolved to deal with. And the result is madness and mayhem. So, now I know that I'm weaving a lot of just so stories here, but, and it's very complicated, and I'm having difficulty keeping this all together. But I think fundamentally this is going to be the way of the future. Because, and I don't want to completely dismiss true ideological beliefs and ideological conversions, but I think that stuff may be a little bit, how do I say this, temporary. Temporary unless you control the institutions of propagandizing, control the schools and the media. Otherwise, there's going to be drift. There's going to be a drift back to biology. So, and this is the biology. Fundamentally, what is left and right? Well, it's about group identity. And I think that's ultimately what it all is. It's group identity. What is libertarianism? Libertarianism is a subway manifestation of white group identity. Or even narrower than that. Narrower than white. More having to do with me and my circle. My circle, my people. People who I identify as my tribe, who are kind of wealthier. Right? And so libertarians tend to be a little bit wealthier. And so they tend to be a little bit. They tend to be wealthy conservatives, okay, right? And what are the perceived benefits for wealthy, economic benefits for wealthy people? It's economic freedom, free markets. That's going to be a perceived benefit for them, and their people. They also tend to be white because if you're black, well, then you have another form of identity, which is racial identity. You have socioeconomic status identity, but there's also racial identity. So if you're rich and white, well, now not only are you, not only is your primary unit, your 150, your Dunbar number, not only is that wealthy, but your race is not as wealthy as your primary unit, but is above everyone else in the United States. So that's that's two forms of identity, and there you go. And if you're by nature a right-winger, meaning that you tend to be more in favor of your group at the expense of out-groups, and you tend to promote traditionalism, well, in the United States you have another issue, which is a traditional interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, which is basically a libertarian interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. That's the traditional interpretation, radical economic freedom. Okay, so you're going to be biased towards that, like a more, you could call it a literal interpretation. Another way to say it is like a real interpretation, right? You're more, no, this is what the traditions are. This is what the traditions say. This is what the traditional texts say. Or before writing, it was the oral histories. This is what the tradition said. Fags go to hell. Okay? That's what the traditions say. And if you abandon the traditions, you're in a sense abandoning the tribe. Okay. Now, and I think that is a biological thing that evolved and is one of the reasons it evolved in the form of conformity. See, another issue is that temperamentally left-wing people, in addition, they have lower testosterone, lower oxytocin. They're also more open to experience, open to novelty of experience, whereas quote-unquote conservatives or right-wingers tend to be more in a rut. They tend to like ruts. I'm in a rut and I like it. They tend to like routine. That's just kind of their nature. Right? They don't like new experiences. Um, "Quote unquote" conservatives, people identify as politically conservatives, tend to have smaller, more redundant groups of friends. Okay, closer relationships, but not as many. Right, and all of these things, these all go back to that tribal dichotomy. You have individuals who are more, let's share with other tribes, let's merge with other tribes. No, let's stay on our own. And in a defeat, in a collective defeat where you get a walloping, your testosterone lowers, and I believe your political views shift left in the face of massive defeats. Um, I know. I believe I've seen this occur in wrestling when a wrestler just gets completely handled multiple times at a meet. What I have noticed is that they will not only be a lot nicer to the wrestlers around them, which you could kind of chalk them up to them. They don't want to get beat up or whatever. But more than that is that I've noticed, and this is in the past. This is before I had any of these theories. Right, this is my perception back then was that people who would lose a lot of wrestling matches would be philosophic, would become slightly philosophically pacifist in the face of massive defeats. I also saw the same thing in football. There was this we went to this horrible football camp. It was the worst football camp ever. And the school went to it. It was a school football camp, and there was this guy who never played football before, and they put him in the linemen, and he was getting his ass kicked, and he came back, you know, early on he was all gung ho about it, but then he came back and he was a bit less gung ho, which I can kind of understand getting your ass kicked. But in addition to that, he started to say all these philosophical things. Started to say that, well, I guess I'm just not, that violent of a person and all that stuff. And what's interesting though is that as he got better, as he physically developed and developed his abilities, he became less like that, and he became more, more full of himself, back to his original self. So, it's so in terms of political views and body. Well, I think that's going to depend on, you know. I'll just put it this way: right wing views are. I mean, and I'm just going to summarize it up this way. And deal with what I call the basic, the more primitive tendencies. The primitive tendencies. When you start getting up into, what is the Libertarian Party? What is radical traditional, quote unquote, radical traditionalism? What is white nationalism? What is black nationalism? What is national socialism? What are all of these things at a higher level? It's really easy to get messed up in there. But the more important thing is to have it has to have a more fundamental thing established. And in order to, and I think the biggest barrier to establishing a more fundamental understanding of the biological left and right is economic freedom, is the historical import of economic freedom in the United States, right? And high levels of economic freedom in the United States are seen as a far-right view, a far-right viewpoint, when really that's not the case at all. Okay, what is the case is that the right is more traditional, is more traditionalist, and economic freedom has been a traditional view of white people in the United States. Okay, not black people, definitely not mestizos at all. Okay, but a traditional view of white people in the United States has been high levels of economic freedom. And so temperamentally right-wing people, temperamentally right-wing white people are going to be more in favor of economic freedom. Okay, temperamentally right-wing black people, who have no tradition of of philosophical economic freedom, philosophical libertarianism, or as it was called back then, liberalism, they're not going to be in favor of economic freedom. Right? Same with mestizos, same with Asian peoples. No history of economic freedom in their country, and so it doesn't carry it forward in any conservative way. So that's just the basic primitives. Is that, right wing, and it makes so much more sense when you have these basic primitive tendencies established, and then you can go into the higher levels and mess up, and then once you mess up, then you can erase it and then go back. But it's easier to have this starting point, of the basic, biology of left and right, and as a basic continuum. When you get into the higher levels, you're dealing with all sorts of issues. You're dealing with overlapping identities. You're dealing with abstract identities. You're dealing with people who deal in group identity but don't know they're dealing in group identity because they're dumb. Okay, and you're dealing with exposure to information. Okay, somebody who is biologically left wing or biologically right wing can be shifted. Right? Classic example. Well, not classic example. Example right here is this guy, Asymmetrical Warfare, Stanley Tweedle, biologically right-wing person, but because of his information exposure was left-wing, that's where he was for a long time. But the biology ultimately wins out, given enough time, and given some information. It just needs kind of an opening to crack through. And if you're left and have been propagandized right, you'll go back left after you go to college. Okay. If you're biologically right and propagandized left and you go to college, you'll stay left. But then when you get out into the real world, you'll probably go right. So that's so there's that, and that creates a complexity at the higher level. But again, at the basic level, it's really about group identity. And once you recognize it's about group identity, and when you recognize that conformity to tradition is connected to group identity, it's one of these traits that intersects. Like foxes in Russia, they bred a bunch of these little silver foxes. They bred some of them to be more vicious, and they bred some of them to be less vicious than wild foxes. And they did this for 8 generations. So after 8 generations, they had 3 groups of foxes. One was the free mating, the control group, which were kind of, they didn't like humans, and they tried to avoid humans. And if you get close to them, they try to run away. But if they were cornered, they try to bite you. So that's the wild foxes. Then they bred foxes that were more vicious. And these more vicious foxes, they would try to attack you. Right? They were feral. A wild fox will kind of look at a human, kind of like a cat almost. It will look at a human, and if the human starts approaching, then the fox will scurry away. Okay, but these bred foxes, they hate people. They hate humans. You so as much as like move your hand towards their cage, they don't get away. They bite it. Okay, and they'll bite you through the cage. And then there's of course the foxes that were bred to be more passive. Now the more passive ones, of course, now domestic dogs that were actually. And this is a settled issue, is that they were bred from domesticated wolves. But they could do the same thing with foxes, and so the foxes came out. And not only were the foxes all licking and cuddling, the ones that were bred to be nicer, but they also developed lighter fur, curlier tails, right? And an ability to understand the point. Right? For example, if you point somewhere, a wolf has no idea what you're doing, what you're getting at. Right? A wolf cannot understand a point. Domestic dogs do. Even little puppies do. A chimpanzee cannot understand a point. Like if you point at something, a chimpanzee is looking at your hand like, what are you doing with your hand there? Okay, chimpanzee can't figure that out. Domestic dog knows that. So that's kind of like a biological biological knowledge. It's not knowledge that they're taught or that they learn, but it's biologically known. And they also have a sort of biological understanding of human expressions. Wolves don't. Wolves can't read your expressions. Wolves don't know when you're sad. Okay, domestic dogs do. Okay, and domestic dogs will try to come lick you and cheer you up when it looks like you're sad. Okay. Domestic dogs also look at your eyes, right? They look at your eyes and see where your eyes are looking, and if you look at somewhere else with your eye, the dog will commonly look to where you're looking at with your eyes, right? The dog knows to look at your eyes, and it knows that if your eyes are closed, that you can't see, right? It knows, right? And the domestic dogs, they look at your eyes, okay? So, and of course, these traits were not specifically selected for, right? All the humans selected for were dogs that seemed more friendly. But as it turns out, in the selection of friendliness, carried along were all these biological cognitive correlates, right? And you could have sort of the same thing going on with humans evolving in tribes. Okay? Biological correlates to group identity, a more narrow group identity as opposed to a broader group identity, which itself is opposed to no group identity, just globalism. Part of that was conformity to tradition, right? And for whatever reason, now, why do group identity and conformity to tradition, why do these go together? You know what? All I know is that they evolved. All I know is that they evolved together, okay? Perhaps there was some sort of functional similarity. I happen to believe that is the case, but that's kind of a just so story. Because a tribe will have beliefs, right? The human mind has this great ability to abstract. Mostly bullshit, but every once in a while it'll do a good thing, and that outweighs all the bullshit. Whales develop giant brains, with which they can circumnavigate the globe via dead reckoning. Humans develop a little area for abstract thought, which allows them to draw a map, right? So, and with that abstract thinking comes, problems, comes bullshit, and it comes, the traditional beliefs, and holding, and so I could see why conformity to traditional beliefs would evolve. That makes sense to me, right? That I can square very easily. Because if you don't believe the traditional beliefs, maybe you're angering the gods, you are likely to bring ill fortune onto the rest of the tribe, you need to get away, because you're danger, right? If you start hunting crabs and they think, crabs are gods or whatever, you're in trouble, okay? And if you don't understand or you don't accept or respect the beliefs of everyone else in your tribe, you're not going to survive very long, okay? So the people who could knew to conform, and not only knew to conform, but had kind of a nuanced understanding of it, they survived better. Okay. Now, I have a suspicion that this conformity to beliefs and traditions. Oh, one more piece of evidence in favor of this before I'm done. But that conformity to beliefs and traditions is also related to group identity. And here's why I think it kind of. Here's what I'm getting at. Group identity itself is a form of conformity to group belief. Okay, let's take a person who's autistic, completely autistic. He does not conform to group beliefs. He does not understand the social makeup of anything. Right? It's like the Onion guy. Like the train runs over some guy, and the autistic guy is like, "Is the train okay? Okay, cool. Can I ride the train?" No social awareness at all. Okay, group identity is part of social awareness. Okay, in order to be aware of group identity, you have to be socially aware. Okay. And so the people who are more socially aware are going to be the ones who are most in tune with when they violate an ideological norm, a belief of the tribe. But another thing about the tribe, the belief of the tribe, is that their tribe is special, is different, is set apart, and is exceptional from the other tribes. That is a belief, right? And so conforming to that belief, well, what you are selecting for is the conformity to beliefs. And if there is to any degree a sense of group identity in the tribe in general, the people who are more conforming to the beliefs of the tribe are going to be more conforming to the beliefs regarding group identity, but also more conforming to the stupid beliefs about, crabs, gods living in crabs, right? Or juju at the bottom of the lake or whatever, right? Both of those conformities are going to happen because that's what's selected for. Okay, what's being selected for is not the belief of group identity or group identitarianism for the tribe, but what's being selected for is conformity to the group beliefs. One of which is the and so a group identity can just be seen as one of those beliefs that is being conformed to, that is being selected for. Okay. One last piece of evidence I want to bring up is brand labels. People who identify as politically conservative are more likely to buy Coke instead of Pepsi, and are more likely to buy name brand instead of store brand. The political, quote-unquote, liberals are more likely to buy store brand. And this is controlling for socioeconomic status. So it's not like, oh, yeah, but so you have a bunch of blacks and mestizos buying cheap store brand. No, when you control for disposable income, the effect still occurs, right? And so the political liberals buy more store brand, conservatives buy more name brand, right? And I think that's a manifestation of this conformity. You can, name brand is better. That's a belief. That is kind of a zeitgeist. Coke is better than Pepsi. That's kind of a zeitgeist belief, and I'm going to conform to that because I'm, biologically on the right. So now there's a problem, okay, with whenever you compare political liberals and political conservatives. I think that the difference between the biological right and biological left are much greater than the differences between political liberals and conservatives. And the reason this is that, for what I've said before, one issue is that identifying with the Democrat Party has itself become a conservative strain, right? It has itself become a tribal identity. And so you get people who are biologically right-wing who identify with the Democrat Party because their dad was Democrat, their grandpa was Democrat, and before that, and they're proud Democrats. Okay? So these people are biologically right-wing, and they're heavily committed to the tradition of voting for the Democrat Party. So you have people like that, right, which weakens the measurement, right? Because that's what political liberalism and conservatism I see them as very dirty proxies for the biological left and the biological right. And another issue is blacks. Blacks completely invert the biology in terms of compared to whites. Or you could say whites invert compared to blacks, depending on your point of view. But blacks, the biologically right-wing blacks, hardcore Democrats. So they kind of fuck it up a little bit. And so that's more dirtiness added to the system. So that's what you get. And now what about, other groups? Other groups, it's a bit more muddled. Like Asian type people, like Japanese or Thais or Indonesians or Indians or mestizos. It depends on what traditions they identify with, right? To figure out if they're biologically right-wing or left-wing, first off, you need to figure out what do they identify with. If they're a mestizo who's a flag-waving American and he supports the Republican Party, well, it's likely that he is biologically right-wing and identifies with America. Okay, and those mestizos, they exist. They do exist. If you have a mestizo who is a flag-waving American and identifies as an American, but is a firm supporter of the Democrat Party, that mestizo, and has no hint of racial nationalism, and in fact is somewhat embarrassed of other mestizos, and yet he votes Democrat, well, that person is probably biologically left-wing. See? And so you can see when you go through these things, there is a logic to all of these things, and I can explain all of these things. But as soon as I start doing it, and as soon as I, talk about the biological basics, the basic biological tendencies, and speculate that, and then from there talk about all these different groups, like a mestizo who identifies as American and hardcore American, and hates, or not hates, but is embarrassed of other mestizos, yet votes Democrat, that's biologically left-wing. But if he was a flag-waving American, but was also a firm, mestizo nationalist, but was not a fan of the government of Mexico, was a believer in both America and, the race, La Raza, whatever. If he was that, and he voted Democrat, well, then that's probably just National Socialism, and he's a biologically right-wing person. See? And that is why. And so when I say these kinds of stuff and then try to apply it at a higher level, people think I'm crazy because they don't share my prior assumptions. Right? I'm going in with completely different priors, and I'm explaining politics in the United States, which is an extremely complex thing. It's a complex thing. Okay, and so you're going to have complex explanations. If you have a super simple explanation, that's suspicious, I think. Now, the priors that go into it don't necessarily have to be that complex. I don't think they really are. So, that's just what I want to say in this video. A lot of speculation, but I think interesting speculation, and, something to think about.